Hello and welcome to the Evolving Spiritual Practice podcast. My name is Ralph Cree and this is brought to you in association with bodyheartmindspirit.co.uk. In this episode I talked to Ngakpa Zhal'med, who is a friend of mine who I lived with in London when we were students, and I hadn't spoken to him for a little bit over 20 years, and during those 20 years, he has become a ordained Tibetan Buddhist in the gTer lineage, and he's a trainee Lama and a teacher. He's been doing that practice in that lineage for over 20 years. Yeah, it was a kind of catch up of what it was like to go from normal person to being a fully ordained Tibetan Buddhist. He's not a monk. He comes from a Tantrik lineage where they are very serious practitioners, but they're not celibate. They're not monks and nuns. You know, they have families, they have jobs, they're in the world, but they're also very serious practitioners. So we discussed what it was like to go through that transition, the types of training he had to do, what the core teachings of the gTer lineage are. It's primarily a Dzogchen lineage, and he's written a book on the student-teacher relationship, and we explored that subject and lots of other things, and it was really fascinating for me. It was very bizarre to go from having not seen him for over 20 years. Normally you sort of do a little bit of small talk to catch up, but we just went straight into a podcast interview with him as a Tibetan Buddhist teacher, and straight into the meaning of life. And yeah, it was a lot of fun for me, and hope you enjoy it. For those listening, this is an unusual episode for me, because today I'm talking with Zhal'med, who I knew as Greg a long time ago. So we haven't spoken in over 20 years, I think. And we lived in London together when we were both students, and we were both really into Tibetan Buddhism and other things at the time. And Zhal'med has gone the whole way, and he now is a fully ordained Tibetan Buddhist, wearing all the robes and everything. And so, I mean, I know nothing of your journey of the last 20 years, and that was what I wanted to explore. In this conversation together, is how does, what's it like for someone to go from, I don't want to use the word normal person, but you know what I mean, just a normal person, to where you are now. And are you a teacher? Do you teach in your tradition as well?
Yeah, I'm what my teachers call a brevet Lama, and brevet very much in the way that the term was used in the military. When one was acting or basically taking over missions that were above one's rank. So in effect, basically we're there's a number of us, we're teachers in training. So, training as Lamas, but practically, yeah, it means I have personal students. I have a small Sangha. I've been teaching for some years. But, that's the way students and senior students are brought into a teaching role little by little. So that's how it happens. So I teach in this tradition, yeah. And maybe going back to your earlier question and really the kind of the meat of what we're going to discuss tonight. I think in many ways you were probably one of these pivotal people in that time 20 years ago now. So it was late 90s. And it was, I think I had a fairly standard journey into Buddhism, where as many of the people that we were kind of mingling with at the time, we were thinking about the meaning of life, what we were doing, studying, where was this going to take us, etc. And I had what you probably had some years before, but this kind of intense period of looking, and reading and trying to understand what it is we're going to be doing, and it was pretty clear, I think, to most of us that what was on the menu, like get a degree, get a career, get a family, just live that life, wasn't really the kind of thing we were after. And I think I've always remembered our time together at that time as being one of these times when you were throwing books at me and saying, oh, you should read this and you should read that, and this is interesting, that's interesting. And so that was fantastic. I have I have fantastic souvenirs of the time, and it was quite an eclectic reading list. There's Carlos Castaneda, and there's all the kind of all the new age stuff that was floating around in the late 90s, crystal healing and all this stuff. And it's true that we were, the things that you and I were both coming back to quite a lot was Tibetan Buddhism. And as it continued, and as the reading list extended to some extent, I found myself coming back to Tibetan Buddhism, and especially teachings from the Nyingma school, and that seemed to be, so that's one of the, without going into any great detail, but it's one of the main schools of Tibetan Buddhism. It's the old school of Tibetan Buddhism, the historical school that dates back to the 8th century, and that was really the teachings that resonated were kind of always from teachers that taught in these traditions and within the Nyingma school, and so that's basically that's how you start. And I remember that when we were sharing a house in can't remember where it was somewhere in zone 2 or zone 3.
Hornsey in London.
Yeah, exactly, the far-flung reaches of northern London. Yeah. I just remember kind of starting a practice, daily practice of silent sitting, which when I think back of it now, it was almost it was brutal. I was forcing myself to sit for about 45 minutes a day, in I think I lotus posture, a half lotus posture, basically, in these physical positions that my knees and my ankles just weren't agreeing with. And I kind of sludged my way through that year of silent sitting, which was great in terms of getting that initial experience. And I think the what happened afterwards is that there's people that go down the rabbit hole the way I did, basically there comes a point where you've read a lot, you've discussed a lot, you've thought about these things quite a bit, you've been off to listen to teachers talk, etc., etc. And I think there's just a point when you realize that you're going to need guidance. You're going to need a kind of one-to-one relationship with someone with whom you're going to be able to get guidance and practical advice and feedback that connects to your actual living conditions, your mental state, etc. And so I was I guess lucky to bump into books. I used to scour these bookshops everywhere in London, these kind of spiritual bookshops and stuff.
We used to go to Watkins bookshop in Leicester, near Leicester Square or something. It's like one of the oldest esoteric bookstores.
Yeah, I think there was one in close to, was it Neil's Garden in Covent Garden, Neil's Yard in Covent Garden. There used to be one of these places that sold a lot of, it was like a kind of spiritual paraphernalia shop. I was there a few years ago, and I think it's turned into a footwear store. It's truly quite depressing in a way, but they used to have, they had stacks of Buddhist books. It was fantastic. And I remember picking up, a book that had been written by Nakchen Rinpoche. That was his author. He went by the name Nakpa Chogyam at the time as an author, and it was a book on Mahayoga. So inner tantra of Nyingma Tibetan Buddhism. So fairly technical stuff, but it was written couched in very experiential English. So what is the actual experience of practicing this stuff like? What does it do? And I think and that was a bit of a pivotal point, because I remember reading that, kind of probably reading about half of it on the bus going back to Hornsey, and then finished reading that, read it a couple of times, and then remembering that there was another book in the bookshop that had been written by him, and going back and buying that. And I just remember the thing that did it for me in some way was that there was just a description of the way we are psychologically, in the way we react to things, and the way things are, both solid and insubstantial at the same time. There was just something that really resonated there. So I read everything that he'd written, and after that, checking up, on the web, what they were doing, and basically there were retreats being taught in Wales. So I thought, okay, well, go to one of those, and I never looked back. I basically became a student in that lineage after my first retreat. So it's in this lineage, it's when you're a student, you become an apprentice. So you're an apprentice Tantrika, and I've stayed since, and that was it. So I guess I've been probably luckier than most, being able to basically kind of find the right thing, find the right fit almost immediately, and stick with it. And that's what I've been doing now for over 20 years. So yeah, it's it's 20 years seems long. I was just very fortunate to kind of find a lineage and a style of practice that I resonated with, almost immediately. I mean, I became a student in that lineage when I was in 2000s. I was 21, just fairly young, and I've stayed with it since.
Yeah, that's great. And I remember, I can actually bring to mind an image, my mind, of you sitting in your room meditating in the half lotus posture. You were very disciplined about it. I really admired that about you. And I also remember reading a book by so he's Nakpa Rinpoche now. Is that his name?
Nakchen, yeah,
Nakchen Rinpoche, yeah. And it's called Wearing the Body of Visions. Is that the book? And I still got it on my bookshelf, actually. And I can remember you coming back and telling me about this interesting guy who was he was German, but he'd had these visions and dreams about being a reincarnation of a Tibetan Buddhist teacher, and he'd his story about going to India and learning with Tibetan Lamas and all that stuff, and it sounded really fascinating. I remember seeing a picture of him in all of his full Tibetan regalia, with all his bells and dorjes and all these things, and his big earrings, big grin on his face, and I thought he looked like a really, really cool guy. Yeah, so I can can remember back to that time. And so the lineage that you've become part of, this gTer, is that how you pronounce it? gTer?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So the gTer lineage has a particular focus on Vajrayana and Dzogchen, as far as I can tell, by looking on the website and stuff, which is great. I want to get into that a bit later, because those are things I still to this day absolutely love. So but so I'm interested that, the first thing I wanted to ask is, for anybody listening to this as well, why of all, so you said we've got this kind of eclectic beginning where you and I were living in London, we're students, we're young, we're sort of taking psychedelics, smoking lots of weed, sitting around talking about the meaning of life, reading all these books from all these different lineages. We're there sitting at the kind of the buffet of all of the things available. And so what made you choose Tibetan Buddhism out of all the things that were on offer at the time? What was special about Tibetan Buddhism for you?
I'm going to say something cliche, so I apologize in advance, but in some ways it feels that Tibetan Buddhism chose me. There was never really a sense in which I'm going to choose this. Now, experientially, what that means is that what you read, and I think the descriptions of the different spiritual states of what realization means, you get a feeling, and that's something that resonates in you. And I think the main thing is that these kinds of descriptions basically talk to a knowledge that you already have, but you've simply forgotten that you had it. And I think that a lot of the experience, when I look back at this, this was basically descriptions of practices, of paths, of states of awareness. It spoke to something in me that it basically hit that kind of intuitive chord where you think, oh, I know what that means. Yeah, I have a feeling for what that is. And this is something that happens in all walks of life. When you have a close friend that tells you about his experience of something that you have no experience of, because they're enthusiastic about it, because they're your friend, you'll listen to it, and something comes through. So you can also you can get a feel for that, even though you don't have the direct experience. And I think that's very much what happened to me when I was in front of the buffet. And you go in for this extremely specialized thing, and you're like, how did that happen? Yeah, it's I mean, I share the same amazement that you probably have of this this vast choice of things. How do you zero into something that specific? I think it's mainly because what you read there resonates, and then because the onus in Buddhism is to practice. You need to. It's not enough to simply listen to the teachings or read the teachings, but you need to practice and see if it makes a difference in terms of your own experience and where that experience takes you. And so you'll practice a bit, then you'll discover some things, and then you'll read a bit more, and then you'll practice a bit more. So study and practice kind of work together in that way, and allow you to, I think, develop a basis of direct experience, which kind of bypasses the need to overthink things too much. And as soon as you've kind of launched into that cycle, basically of practicing, studying, the path kind of becomes a natural flow. So once that cycle is started, you just keep going. There's no sense in which, well, I mean, I guess there can be, but I never had any sense in which I've discovered this, but this is not what I want, so I'm going to go back to the buffet and look for something else. There was never that idea. So yeah, I don't know what else I can really say about that. It's just there was just a strong pull from the start. There was a strong pull from the start. So it's mysterious. Does it mean that you've been involved in this in the past? Maybe. Is it just something that you resonate with, and this is what will work with you in this life? Maybe. Who knows?
Yeah, so the bulk of my practice over the last 20 years has been Tibetan Buddhist in origin, and when I first encountered Tibetan Buddhism, it just instantly recognized it. I was like, this makes perfect sense to me. I really felt like coming home, in a way I'd never had with Christianity or anything like that. And yeah, it does make you, I mean, I've at the end of the day, I don't know a damn thing about anything. So, I mean, really, I don't even know what is going on. But, you do ask, naturally, you ask questions like, why have I got such an affinity for this? Because it's Tibetan culture is so alien. I mean, you're French, I'm English. Nothing in our background had that. I mean, the only exposure I'd had, apparently the Ewoks in Star Wars speak Tibetan. Right. Yeah, that is like the only exposure I'd had to it. But I think, so, one thing that does stand out about Tibetan Buddhism, I don't know who said this, but I think this is true, that Zen is sort of essential Buddhism, and Tibetan Buddhism is complete Buddhism. It's got the sutra teachings, Vajrayana, Dzogchen, the Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana, Dzogchen, it's all in there. And Zen, it gets right to the point. I mean, because Zen is something I've also been very interested in, and was at the time when we were in London, and I've enjoyed it, but I've always felt it to be slightly lacking in the depth that I found in Tibetan Buddhism. And I see that. So so I'm also interested in why you chose the Arrow-Ter tradition as I mean, you've touched on this, but that there are more traditional Tibetan Buddhist lineages and schools, but you've chosen one which is a little bit unconventional. We can get into that in a bit, but why you could have gone to study with Namkhai Norbu or some other teacher like that sort of got more of a traditional Tibetan lineage, and I think you have touched on it a little bit, that you liked the style of the teacher in the Arrow-Ter, but what have you got to say about that?
There was a time, again, when I was, before I decided that I'd, go down and, meet these, Arrow-Ter people and see what they were about. There was a time where I contemplated becoming a monk, because, that seemed to be one of the ways, in which you could actually, dedicate your life to serious practice. And at the time, I was looking around. There's quite a number of monastic centers, even in France, linked to the Kagyu lineages, Nyingma lineages, etc. So I was thinking this could be a way, to discover a bit more, and so that the whole monastic route at one point seemed to be an option. And I think it's basically when I met my teachers, and because what they said resonated. And I just decided that this is their path, so I might as well try this, and we'll see where it goes, and the Arrow-Ter exists within a tradition, Nyingma tradition, which is called the Gugga Changludi, so the white Sangha, or the lineage of Nakpas and Nakmas. So it's basically Tantrik ordination. There's it's basically the ordination, or the form of ordination which is based in the tantras, whereas monasticism and the monastic vows are based in sutra, and this whole ethos of being able to live in the world without renouncing the world, yet being able to engage in a level of practice which is extremely involved, I thought was just I thought it was just something that was worth a try, considering my situation at the time, but I wasn't a great wanderer explorer. I didn't particularly want to go off to India or Nepal and go looking for a potential Lama somewhere out in the east, and because all of this was basically on my doorstep, I was 3-hour train journey away from Paddington Station. that seemed fair enough. I kind of I thought, we'll give this a go. And the ethos of what was taught, what resonated with me. The descriptions, or the basically the description of the nature of mind, of its of our confusion, of our potential for realization, all of this made sense and connected. And so I didn't, and for some years actually, I had no idea that the gTer was fairly unconventional. Actually, it's unconventional for Westerners. It's a very interesting thing, because it's when you talk to Nyingma Lamas, especially in Bhutan, the gTer is extremely conventional. It's simply a Dzogchen lineage, and so the emphasis is on things which weren't or aren't apparent in the West. When Westerners approach the kind of Tibetan Buddhist setup in the West, which is very much geared toward monasticism. So there was also what you were saying with Namkhai Noble Rinpoche. I mean, Namkhai Noble Rinpoche could have been an option. It's just that I didn't have a connection at the time. I read some of his books. He seemed to have a massive sangha. I thought it'd be difficult to approach and be able to study closely with him. He had thousands of students. And so I think something about the kind of family aspect, or the family lineage aspect of the gTer, where teachers stop taking students above 111 students, and this emphasis on having small close sanghas, so that practice can actually occur, so that people can relate to each other as sangha members, so that you can have a direct relationship with the teacher, rather than the rock star teacher that comes to your city or your country once every 2 years, and there's fawning disciples everywhere. And it just seemed a more workable proposition, in terms of actually making progress. And so I thought, and I thought I'll give this a go, and I might as well do this in as pragmatic a way as possible, kind of really work with the teacher. It might not be a Tibetan rock star Lama, but at least it'll probably help me get somewhere, rather than kind of imagining I'm getting somewhere and just playing around. So I think it was a wager. I took the risk. It was a risk to take, and I thought I'll take this risk. It makes sense, and we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, I really like the idea where you each teacher doesn't take more than 111 students, and you've got kind of this sort of holonic structure of different teachers that have all got students and this kind of personal connection. And that is very different, as you say, to the rock star teacher, where you may never even get to talk to them. You might go up and receive an empowerment or something like that, but to actually have a conversation would be very rare. And you may have one conversation in your life. That might be it. Yeah. And the other, so someone who looks at you wearing all the dress you wear and all that kind of stuff, they might think, all right, this guy's a monk. But the lineage you're from is about something very, very different. I mean, this is an important thing to bring up, because when Westerners think of becoming a serious Tibetan Buddhist, for example, they think, all right, well, I'm going to have to become a monk. I'm going to have to, give up my job, become celibate, live a life of poverty, and, not have any relationships, and all of those kind of things, which, that's a way to go. And is that I just after we left London, I wanted to become a hermit. My kind of archetype was Milarepa or someone like that. That's who I wanted to be. But actually, I did a little bit of that kind of life, and actually, I decided I didn't want to do that. And I, so so I've been getting the last few years very into the non-dual Shiva Tantra. from India, and from my understanding of that, the Tantric approach started as a way of teaching that was not for people who were not monks and nuns, and for lay people that had jobs, they had families, they weren't celibate. So you become a serious practitioner, but at the same time, not renouncing the world. And there's that, it feeds very much into this thing of nirvana and samsara being one thing. This world's a kind of garden of delights to be explored. That's that. In the non-dual Shaiva Tantra tradition, the senses are goddesses, that kind of deliver offerings to the sort of central deity, which is your sort of formless awareness, Shiva, or the great goddess, or whatever. And I love that approach, and I've come to appreciate it more and more as year and year goes on. And I've got a family, I'm married, I've got a job, but I've always been a really serious practitioner of this stuff. But I've never wanted to become a monk or a nun. And so I just wanted to bring this out for people listening, that being a monk or a nun is not the only thing on offer. You can even dress like you are in all the stuff. I mean, I know you don't go to work wearing this stuff. It's only when you're teaching. Yeah.
No, I don't. That would be quite fun. I think that would be a shocker for some people.
You work in a bank or something, is it?
No, I don't work in a bank. I work in communications and branding. I'm basically managing director of an agency. So I'm as involved in samsara as possible. Yeah. Basically, and I think that's part of the practice, and that's part of the magic of the practice. But what you say is, this goes back to the in terms of Hindu Tantra and Buddhist Tantra, this goes back to the Mahasiddhas of India, which predate anything that could have happened in Tibet, and really it's as you say, the way that the method of transmission at the time of the Mahasiddhas worked was teacher to student. Generally there was one or a few meetings, but there was a high point or a pivotal point where the teacher transmitted a method of practice to the students, which is druptop, and sadhana. That's where that comes from. People think that sadhana is texts, pesha texts, full of words, but actually a sadhana, a druptop, means method of accomplishment. So whatever your teacher gives you is a method of accomplishment. And in the style of the Mahasiddhas, basically they gave very simple, direct instructions to a disciple, and that disciple, who and they would come from all walks of life. You've probably read about this, but there were prostitutes, there were bankers, there would have been kings, there would have been cobblers, people from all walks of life. There was the enlightened idiots. You'd really have all the psychological types, and people from the whole spectrum of ancient India, and they would receive this method, they would practice it, and that's how they would gain realization. And that style of practice, in which basically anything can be your style of practice, anything can be your practice if that's what your teacher sets up for you, is in some ways is an extremely pure form of understanding of Vajrayana, because it takes that same principle and it extends it and expands it. Now, in terms of this style of dress and this style of practice, this was introduced by Guru Rinpoche, in Tibet in the 8th century, when he initiated, when he basically created or launched Vajrayana practice in the Himalayas. You know, and it was so this style of practice is called the gKachanglo, which means you know, it's long hair, white clothes. And this style of practice is based, coming back to what you were saying, it's based on Kadag. And Kadag is, you know, primal purity. And that's what the white represents, you know, primal purity. And so it's taking all of phenomenal of exist, you know, taking the view that all of phenomenal, the whole phenomenal universe and all of phenomenal existence is already pure, you know, it's pure from the beginning. And it's basically, you know, taking that as the base and as the method of working with what you experience, you know, the whole, you know, gamut of different methods that there are. And that existed as a style of practice in parallel to the red Sangha. So this is the white Sangha, you know, in parallel to the red Sangha, which was the monastic Sangha, with, you know, vows based in sutra. And this style of practice existed for a long time. And really, and, you know, if we launch into this could be you know, another 3 hours, but the reason that it's, you know, it's become, you know, less obvious, sometimes decried, and virtually unknown to vast, you know, swaths of, you know, Tibetan practitioners, is that basically, you know, the Tibetan political and religious power structure was built around monasticism, because, you know, when you have you know, a monastery, when you have hundreds of people reciting your texts, etc., it was a way of both showing power. It was a way of you know, collecting sponsors, getting donations, getting money. I mean, at its high point, I think you had about 1/5 of the Tibetan population that was, you know, practicing in a monastic setting. So it was a country where 20% of the population were monks. So, you know, this was it was a massive power structure, and, you know, an organization of society in some ways. And the gKachanglo did, so the white Sangha, always existed at its periphery, and it was always more anarchic, you know, disorganized. You know, it wasn't institutional in any way, and so it was both less visible, because, you know, when you're less you know, institutional, you don't have the big buildings, you know, you're not, you know, giving out uniforms where everyone practices or seems to be, you know, looking the same and practicing the same thing. You become less visible. And it was also, I think, one of the things which is fairly misunderstood, is that in Vajrayana, you know, your teacher is the only teacher that counts, you know, and what other teachers have to say are of, you know, little interest to you, you know, in terms of, you know, the context of Vajrayana practice. That's why, you know, when people say, you know, the Dalai Lama is the Pope of Buddhism, you know, he's not. He's basically the head of one of the schools, you know, and he happens to be the, you know, a political leader as well, but he has no or little sway, you know, over the other schools. And if you take that, and, you know, and this was in the context of, you know, the Tibetan society and the Tibetan political structure, this was a problem. It was a problem that you had a number of yogis, wild yogis sometimes, running around doing their own thing and not paying allegiance to, you know, the institutional power heads. So there came a time, and, you know, we won't go into this now because we don't have time, but there came a time when the gKachanglo was persecuted because they were just doing their own thing, you know. And so this is one of the reasons this style of practice became less visible. It didn't stop existing, it just went underground more. And it also, you know, it was also, you know, criticized by, you know, and you know, diminished by, you know, the whole monastic structure, saying, oh yeah, they're just village nakpas. You know, this became a derogatory term, you know, a nakpa, village nakpa. It's a guy with, you know, just doing kind of shamanic practices, you know, in a dirty white robe. You know, that's the kind of stigma that became attached to this style of practice. Whereas you have, you know, in the late 20th century, you had, you know, teachers of the Nyingma school, like Dudjom Rinpoche. You probably heard of Dudjom Rinpoche. I mean,
Yeah.
Dudjom Rinpoche was probably the biggest Nyingma Lama in the 20th century. He's, a bit like the Karmapa to the Kagyus. He was this, Dudjom Rinpoche was that to the Nyingma, and he was an Akpa. And and many of his, of those great lamas were also Nakpa. So basically, to rein this in, when Nakchon Rinpoche, my teacher, went to Nepal, he studied closely with Dudjom Rinpoche for some years, and it's the one promise that he made to Dudjom Rinpoche, was to develop or promote the Gurkha Changlo days, or this Nakpa form of ordination in the West. Dudjom Rinpoche always told him, you need to go back to the West. You'll teach one day. You'll hold a lineage. And he said, this style of practice is very, is extremely adapted to the Western lifestyle. And so it was the main, it was one of the main tasks that Nakchon Rinpoche had coming back to the West, was to, of course, start teaching, have a sangha, but really show that this style of practice was possible, that it was a serious style of practice, and that it could be of benefit to people.
Yeah, I like it. I like it. I mean, in a way, it's as a lineage, because it's got this amorphousness and it's not institutionalized, that actually gives it a sort of evolutionary advantage in terms of surviving for a long time, even though it's persecuted, and but it's because institutions crumble, they come and go. But if what your practice lineage is like Morph. Did you ever watch Morph, that kids program with there's this like plastic character called Morph, and he could just change into any shape? It's that kind of that's it's a very sane way of doing it, but less safe, because you don't have the sort of big daddy institution kind of covering your back. One of the teachers that your teacher studied with was Zhal'med Ye-Rig and Lama. I mean, probably my pronunciation is not so good. Your Tibetan's very good. I remember going to an empowerment with him in London, actually. He was really old at the time, in a wheelchair. And I mean, it looked like he couldn't even straighten his legs out anymore. He basically probably just was either sitting cross-legged, meditating, or in a wheelchair. I think I remember seeing your teacher there with his wife, with all the clothes on and stuff, up in the front row. And yeah, it was an empowerment ceremony, and they use, so this is in, I don't know if you've come across this, but Amrita is something that comes up in tantric initiations and empowerments, this substance. And I mean, there are people that have suggested that it could have been a psychedelic substance. I mean, you guys, it's said a few times on your website that drinking alcohol is okay, not to excess, but to enjoy alcohol, but you don't promote the use of any other substances. But have you ever come across that as a concept?
I think one of the I have very little to say about this, so sorry. I'll be disappointing, because it's not something we practice with. And yeah, I mean, anything that kind of affects the Salung system in an adverse way, is basically kind of not something we use in the Arata lineage. But one of the people that you'd want to ask this question to is Ian Baker, and you've probably come across some of his writings or his teachings. He's I think Tibetologist. He's a scholar and practitioner. I think his root teacher was Chacha Rinpoche, also one of the great Nyingma Lamas of the 20th century. And he's written a lot about this, and he's researched it a lot. He's written some articles, and it's in some of the books I've read that are from him, and that's something he's very much into. But I unfortunately I don't have anything useful to say about that. It's not an aspect of our practice.
Yeah, no, it's more of a footnote on the conversation, for anyone who's interested to kind of follow that up. But
Ian Baker, he's definitely one of the more accessible and knowledgeable people about that subject. Yeah.
So my podcast is about practice. This is all about, and that's I'm into practice, long-term practice over decades and all of that. And so I'm interested that you've got in this gTer lineage, you do this what you call sutra teaching, which would be more the sort of Hinayana Mahayana sort of text. Is that right? Yeah. And then also the Vajrayana, which is the Tantrik teachings, and then also the Dzogchen teachings. So that's you've got it all there, the whole lot. And how does that happen? Do you kind of work your way through sutras and then Vajrayana stuff and then Dzogchen, or do you start with some Dzogchen? I mean, I know it's quite common with Dzogchen for people to basically do the introduction to the nature of mind right at the beginning, and then you kind of practice your way through stuff. So how do those three types of teaching mesh in your lineage, and how do you teach them, and what's your own personal practice look like over these 20 years? If you kind of work through different levels and all these sort of things. It's a great big question. I understand that. I know.
Yeah, no, but that's fine. I'll try to say something useful. I think the starting point is that the gTer is a Dzogchen lineage. Now, what does that mean? Because if you look at it, you think, oh, okay, so it's like the highest teachings and la-di-da. But being a Dzogchen lineage basically means that the emphasis is going to be on Dzogchen view and Dzogchen practice. Now, Dzogchen practice, unless you have experience of Rigpa, the realized state, you're not practicing Dzogchen. So I mean, I think that needs to be pretty clear. Basically Dzogchen is the practice of realization. The practice of Dzogchen is essentially when you've strayed from the non-dual states, you apply remedies to return to the non-dual state. And that's not a proposition that's going to work for the vast majority of people. Very, very few of us are at the base of Dzogchen. The base of Dzogchen being the enlightened state. Very, very few people are going to be in this situation. So there's secondary practices. In the gTer, we always consider that, silent sitting, whatever your level of silent sitting, so whether you're striving to discover emptiness, striving to discover the movement in the emptiness, and then, striving to understand or experience their non-duality, whatever your level of practice, it will always be considered that silent sitting is the primary thing. Now, that probably makes sense to you in terms of what you've prioritized over the years, etc. But if you look at Tibetan Buddhism as a whole, the kind of the type of practice that seems to be prioritized most is chanting sadhanas, and that's what you see when you go to Buddhist retreats, or when you go to empowerments or things. There'll be a great deal of chanting. which is, a style of practice which is more connected to, Maha Yoga. So, the inner tantras, but the symbolic, transformational aspects of Tantra. So, having said that, in a Dzogchen lineage, the onus, the focus will the priority of practice will always be, the contemplative practices around silent sitting. But it also means that because it's a lineage, and because you need to be able to address the needs of people who aren't at the base of Dzogchen, who don't have everyday experience of Rigpa, there will be teachings about sutra, there'll be teachings on tantra, but the specificity will be that they will be taught from the perspective of Dzogchen. And so, for instance,
do you mean, so if I'm just for trying to make this simple for someone listening in simple terms, that when you say the perspective of Dzogchen is that everything is perfect already, that everything, just absolutely everything, the entire cosmos is perfect, the supreme being always, and it's just a case of recognizing that, as opposed to a different approach, which would be gradually perfecting yourself or the world around you through gradual practice. So yeah.
No, that's very well said. The perspective of Dzogchen is that everything is already perfect, and we've just lost the view. We've forgotten it. It's a cosmic mistake. It's like, it's almost a joke. The great perfection of our mind and of everything that comes into contact with our sense fields is inherently perfect. We just lost it, and so it starts from the top and it deconstructs. So you say, okay, you've lost it, so we're trying to look, where you got lost, and so that's where you kind of hook people into it. What you're describing in terms of the gradualist approach, which is the other approach, where little by little, in some sense, you're uncovering, you're taking away layers of confusion through gradual practice. That would be the view of sutra and tantra. So that would be, the way that the way the teaching would be explained would be coming from a position where you've got a fundamental problem here. You've got a fundamental problem, and these are the antidotes that you need to apply. When you're coming from the perspective of Dzogchen, the perspective is, there's no problem. It's all fantastic, and so these are the kind of, and really these are the two extremes of Buddhist practice, because basically it's really a continuous and continual line that takes you from the very beginning to the very end. What's particular about Buddhism is that any teaching can address almost any style of confusion, but the language will be different. If it's the language sutra, the language of sutra can talk about Dzogchen, but it'll do so in the language of sutra. Dzogchen can talk about sutra, but it'll talk about sutra in the language of Dzogchen. So a very basic example here. Let's take the 5 precepts. You don't kill, you don't steal, you don't lie, etc., etc. These 5 precepts. If you take the precepts of you're to refrain from killing, in the sutric view. So if you take that, if that's explained in the view of sutra, well, it'll be explained because when you kill, you're actually reinforcing your negative habits. You're actually reinforcing your hate, and killing is not a good thing, etc., etc., etc. Without getting into any moralistic things. If you look at how that would be expressed from the perspective of Dzogchen, basically not killing, you would refrain from killing the enlightened state, which is always continually present. That's how it would be explained. our problem is that we hide from our realized state rather than embracing it. That's how it would be explained from the perspective of the result of the fruit. I don't know if that makes sense. But basically, coming back to your question, and I get your point of trying not to be too technical. In this lineage, the main emphasis is always on silent sitting. Silent sitting will always be the primary practice. You'll have sutric methods, but they won't be they will be taught from this perspective of Dzogchen, but it will be sutric methods in terms of how do you rein in your neurotic speed, the speed of your dualistic tendencies, and basically that would relate to shine, the practice of silent sitting, shamatha in Sanskrit. When you practice shine, so when you're disengaging from the content of your mind and trying to find the empty state, that basically is the essential practice of sutra. So that's how sutra would be addressed in the perspective of the Arutaya. And then as you move through the different yanas, the different vehicles, moving from sutra to tantra to Dzogchen, there's a great deal of tantra in the Arutaya. So transformational practices, deity practices, practices of visualization. But they're always taught with the Dzogchen ethos. So they'll be very essentialized. There, for example, there will only be the central deity. In many other Mahayoga approaches, Tantra can become extremely detailed. There'll be a central deity, there'll be deities around, a great mandala, there'll be many, many implements. There's no end to the level of detail that you can bring into that. But in the perspective of a more Dzogchen lineage, well, the transformational aspects of deity practice will be there. It'll be practiced, but in a way which doesn't take you, you won't be reciting out 2 or 3 hours of text today. It'll be a very essential practice where maybe there's only one mantra. You'll self-arise. It's a practice that you can do in 5 minutes rather than 2 hours. So that's the kind of specificity that you can have in these Dzogchen lineages. Tibetan Buddhism is can be overwhelmingly baroque in terms of the symbolism, the detail. I mean, it can be crazy. I mean, luckily I don't know if it's luckily, but it's I made the choice of a more essentialized form of practice. So that was easier. I'm not saying it's better, because I can see the advantages of the very kind of detailed and highly ritualistic aspects of Tibetan Buddhism. I guess it just it's in terms of what you resonate with and what you connect with. Yeah. I think the heavily ritual type is difficult on a day-to-day level. It's not an easy thing to practice in the West, basically.
No, well, yeah, I mean, it's all consuming, from the moment you get up to the moment you go to sleep. It's just an endless, it just, as you were saying earlier, it's a type of practice which evolves within a monastic setting with monasteries, and basically it's a feudal structure, which, France and England were feudal places in the medieval times, but those days are long gone, and for good reason in many senses. So so it's interesting that you say that the kind of main type of practice that's done in your lineage is the silent sitting meditation, because when you look at other schools of Tibetan Buddhism or lineages, they have these very, very say to become ordained, you have to do a certain number of repetitions of a mantra, and retreats of different lengths, and all sorts of different training. So is that part of your lineage at all, or is it Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, when you maybe I can talk a little bit about how your practice is structured when you become a student in this lineage. And
yeah,
and
that's
so,
that's what I'm getting at. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's essentially there'll be silent sitting, there'll be mantra practice, and there will be a type of physical exercise called the kumye. And these three really relate to body, speech, and mind. Body being the kumye aspect of the practice, so it's a form of physical yoga. It doesn't look at all like yoga, but it looks like nothing at all actually. But it's it's a form of practice which is contemplative in nature. So you'll do a number of repetitions of a certain exercise, and then you'll sit in or lie down actually in a meditation posture to experience what you experience. So that's body. Speech is more connected with mantra. And so, you'll be given, a specific mantra, either Yeshe Tsogyel or Padmasambhava, when you become a student. And so you need to accumulate a certain number of repetitions of that. And then silent sitting, which will always be prioritized. I mean, when I say that silent sitting is central, it's, in a given day, if you have time for nothing else, what you'll prioritize is silent sitting. If you have more time, you can do other things. But that's why, the kind of foundation is always silent sitting. It's also silent sitting mainly because you can't really experience what there is to experience if you don't have the early fruits of silent sitting. If you don't have experience of emptiness, or the initial glimmer of emptiness, it's very difficult to relate to tantric practices and practices which require basically emptiness as a basis for the rest. So that's I would say that's how your practice is structured as a student. Now, in terms of ordination, there will be certain requirements. So a certain number of weeks of solitude retreat, a certain number of repetitions of mantra. You need to pass examinations, etc. So you need to study as well and pass examinations. So it's quite a consequent curriculum, but with reason, because basically when you take tantric ordination, it's an ordination you take forever. You take it for this life and you take it for all lives, and so there needs to be a kind of critical mass of experience for that to be a feasible proposition, for it not to be just a kind of romantic daydream. So you need to have put in the hours in terms of study, in terms of practice, in terms of retreat, so that that you're comfortable doing this for the rest of your life.
So say a bit more about your solitary retreats that you did.
I think my initial experiences of solitary retreat were hell on earth. I think I started solitary retreats probably too early in terms of the practice experience I had. And I remember starting. My lamas were telling me, start with maybe like a weekend, long weekend, 3 days, maybe 4 days, see how it goes. And so, the days, the schedule is pretty rigorous in the way it's built in this lineage, because you basically get up around 7, you'll go to bed at about 10 or 11 at night, and your day will be made up of a certain number of sessions, generally between 1 and 2 hour sessions, alternating kumye, so physical practices, silent sitting, and mantra practice. And you'll get a break, about 1 hour break for breakfast, 1 hour break for lunch, 1 hour break for dinner. So all in all, you're on a regimen of about 12 to 13 hours of practice a day, which is pretty, which is pretty rough, and especially I mean, it's the way I did this. I did this, you know, in an apartment. I mean, you set up, you decide the boundaries of your retreat. You know, you decide what the boundaries are. You know, you could decide to do it in a vast house with a big garden, and during your break times you can go for a walk in the garden. But I was living in cities, you know, I was the urban ape at the time, so living in apartments, you know, so I was basically doing this in little space, and it was horribly claustrophobic. I mean, the initial bouts of solitary retreat were really hardcore, and it took me some years before you know, I'd gotten, you know, far enough in practice so that, you know, it wasn't, you know, this all-consuming claustrophobia. And as time goes by, I mean, in the curriculum for ordination in the I would say you need to do one stint of 3 weeks in one go. So, you know, that's like the big one. You can accumulate, I think it's 9 weeks all in all. You can accumulate the 9 weeks in little bits, you know, 3-4 days, you know, 1 week, etc. But you need to do one 3-week stint. And I remember going into this and wondering, okay, you know, this is going to be hellish. We'll see how this goes. But in actual fact, there's quite an interesting phenomena that happens, because all the days, you know, because all the days resemble each other. I mean, you know, the schedule moves into the heart of the retreat, which is maybe about, you know, like the middle of the retreat, which is the heart of the retreat, where you're sleeping very little. You're maybe getting 5-6 hours sleep a night, and you know, the rest of the time is practice. And you enter this kind of distortion of time when time starts to accelerate, both because, you know, the days are, you know, all kind of organized in the same way, so that there's a kind of, I wouldn't call it monotony, but there's something of that nature where you start to lose track of what day, you know, which day is which, and, you know, when did I have what experience, you know, that something starts to happen there because, you know, you play with time. And I also think, I mean, it was Naksha Rinpoche once talked about some of his initial experiences in retreat like this, and he was saying he only managed, you know, he was talking about the claustrophobic aspect of these retreats, and he was saying, the only way I was able at one point to stay in retreat was I was, you know, I was going to decide that I was going to die here. I was never going to leave, you know, metaphorically speaking, of course, but he had to accept the fact that this was the new normal, that he would die in retreat, and that was it. And something of that nature happens in these longer retreats when you're struggling. There comes a point where you stop struggling because there's no point anymore, and that's when it opens up. And so these experiences of retreat, you know, really, I'd say, it's what I always tell people, really intense in both the good ways and the bad ways. You know, you have you know, extremely claustrophobic moments, and you have these extremely extraordinary moments of, you know, of openness and presence, and it's just the context of the retreat is a kind of you know, boiler cooker or something, you know, that kind of magnifies and intensifies everything, and to a point where things start to happen. Now, you know, 15 years or so, you know, onwards, I can go into retreat now without it being this kind of hellish experience. But I remember you know, doing those 9 weeks in order to be ordained. It was rough. It was rough. But there's something very interesting that happens there, because it deconstructs your practice. There's no room to pretend your practice is not what it is. And I think that's the purpose in terms of preparation for ordination. It puts you into this kind of pressure cooker, where the stories you tell yourself about how you practice, about what you know how to do, etc. There's such intensity and such pressure in terms of you know, accumulation and, you know, and time spent that everything kind of breaks down. So you're left, and I have experience of some of my Vajra brothers and sisters talking about this and saying, my whole practice fell apart and I was left with nothing else than silent sitting, and so I just sat, and I practiced Shine for a week. And I think those are the kinds of experiences that you have. It's you can't kid yourself anymore in terms of what your level of practice is, and I think that's really that's valuable. As a practitioner, you get to you're really confronted with what you are and what your practice is worth. I don't make retreats sound fantastic, but basically it isn't. I think it's especially this kind of concentrated form of retreat is really intense.
Yeah, I mean, I did one of these 10-day Vipassana retreats, and just basically 10 days of physical agony, and yeah, and yeah, I mean, it's a whole nother thing that I won't bring up because it's a massive topic. But I feel so one of my no, I'm not even going to go there, but I know what you mean. And during that, I kind of went in there with all these big ideas about what I was going to do, and it was very humbling. And
yeah, that's well put.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people, at the end of it, we were all talking, and a lot of people had the same experience, and it's good in those situations to not pretend that you've done things you haven't, yeah. So
no, it's very humbling. It was interesting experience because when when the world went into lockdown, was it last year, 2020? When the whole COVID situation started, and basically France went into lockdown for initially it was to be 3 weeks, and then in the end it was over 2 months. I said, oh, this is the perfect situation, and so I started a retreat, doing the Tibetan system. You do it's 4 practice sessions in the day, so 4 times an hour and a half, so 6 hours, and in between that I was with my family doing other things, etc. But it kind of puts your practice under a microscope, and I thought I'll start with the 3 weeks, and in the end I did almost 3 months, which is something I'd been wanting to do for forever, being able to do a long period, and that was absolutely fantastic. I mean, I hadn't done kind of practiced intense retreat for maybe 5 or 8 years. There was the children, and I know there was always something to do, and this was like the perfect opportunity to be stuck somewhere and to get on with it, and that was absolutely fantastic. And I think it was fantastic probably because I could it was 6 hours and not 13, so that makes a difference, but also because I didn't put any great pressure on myself for this thing. There was no great expectation. I just thought, I'll just take what I practice and I'll just do more of it. But it has this effect, and that's why practitioners go into regular retreats like this, because it does you do break through barriers. That makes it sound all grand. I think it's just that you do go through a threshold of intensity, which and things move, and so that happens. I think the real thing that people need to pay attention to is that you can't do it too soon, and not going back to the Vipassana thing, but I've also heard many people going into that kind of gung-ho, and it's too much too soon. And I think the second thing, and this is what I always tell some of my students, is if you're going to do this, you can build in some emergency exits if you need them. Say I'm going to do 36 hours, and if it's going badly, then I'll stop. If I can't do any more, I'll stop. I think one of the great dangers is going into Solitude Retreat too soon, and then basically it being so hard that you never want to do it again. That's a great shame. So when you guide people through this, I think that those are some of the things you kind of need to be wary of. You know, it's the whole, you know, go through your pain barrier and, you know, push through it. You know, it can be a good idea for some people, but it can put some people off for life. So
yeah, that's really good advice.
Yeah,
there's a sweet spot, and that's where we want to where we want to work. So there's just two more things I wanted to explore with you. So one is, I was really pleased to see on the gTer website, you've got this whole page devoted to what you call the 5 ethical precepts to protect students. I've got a conversation lined up with Mary Finnegan, who wrote a book about Tsogyel Rinpoche called Sex and Violence in Tibetan Buddhism, The Rise and Fall of Tsogyel Rinpoche. And this is not a situation that's unique to Tibetan Buddhism. This is gurus, teachers from India, Japan, Tibet, American, you know, European. This is one of the sort of the perils that people face when they're getting into this kind of thing. Is, you know, I'm not talking about nerfing up the world. You know, nerf's that kind of like foam material that makes everything safe. You put on all the corners. I'm not talking about, you know, life is not safe, and the fact that life is a bit dangerous, you know, that's an enlivening thing on the spiritual path. But having said that, you know, because it's a bit the same as what we're talking about with retreats, there's a sweet spot, and there's been really horrendous abuse by teachers of students, you know, and they tend to cluster around this unholy trinity of power, sex, and money. And, you know, I think a lot of gurus or big spiritual teachers can be a bit blasé about all this stuff. But I think it's really important. And so I didn't write down what the 5 ethical precepts were. Do you know them off by heart? I'm putting you on the spot here, but you've got this kind of well, what's the word, a protocol for how to be ethical teachers that are not going to take advantage of people who are, you know, when you're starting out on this spiritual path, you're I mean, I certainly was very impressionable and vulnerable to exploitation, because you're dealing with layers of your psyche which are not rational. You know, you're delving down into the imaginal realms of your psyche, and it's a very vulnerable place. So, you know, what could you just say more about the way your particular lineage, teaching lineage and setup of teachers ensure that people are not exploited?
Yeah, I think that's, you know, it's one of those topics where, you know, there's no clear-cut solution and answer to. I mean, it's you know, I share everything that you've described, and I think in part the fact that there's those you know, that basic, that those, you know, ethical you know, engagements here is that Naksham Rinpoche saw, I mean, you know, he saw Tsogyel Laka you know, do everything he did in the 80s and the 90s. You know, he was you know, he saw that whole scene basically, you know, and has been very wary of it since. In the gTer, one of the main, I mean, some of the key safeguards that have been put in place are the fact that there's a very high stress on respect between the two sexes. You know, as in men respecting women, you know, because each woman is the khandro, and each man is the pao, and so respecting the feminine principle or the masculine principle in each other. So there's tremendous emphasis on respect between the sexes, equality between the sexes, and absolutely no tolerance whatsoever of lewd behavior, and anything of that sort, leads to kind of rapid, ending, termination of apprenticeship. One of the things that Nakshar Rinpoche and Khandro Dechin have always been really keen on is the principle of the teaching couple. It's one of the particularities of this lineage, is that the preferred mode of teaching, and it's not true for all the teachers. I mean, my wife is not a practitioner, not a teacher, but the preferred mode of teaching is teaching couples. So married couples who are both ordained and teachers, and this creates a form of safeguard which is stronger than when it's just a solitary male teacher, or a solitary female teacher with their students. So this is one of the things that has been that's been stressed a lot. And at the heart of the Arhoter, I'd say the most fundamental teaching of the Arhoter is basically a teaching on the spiritual value of romantic relationship. I'm not going to say the Tibetan, but it's basically seeing being in love with your partner as a fundamental way to see your non-dual or enlightened nature reflected in your partner. If you're completely open to the person you love, and the person you love is completely open to you, this is it's an extremely easy way as a practitioner to be able to experience the enlightened state. And this is very much the essential teaching, one of the essential teachings of the Arhoter. And for that to be possible, where there's always a great emphasis on the quality of your relationship, both with your partner, but with people within the sanghas as well. So I'd say there's a great degree of awareness, which is focused on these things in terms of interpersonal relationships, etc. I mean, in many Tibetan sanghas, people will fight, there'll be issues, there'll be conflict, etc. And the lamas will just wait for these things to to play themselves out, and they won't intervene. In the Aro sanghas, the teachers will do more of that, in terms of making sure that people get on and that interpersonal conflict is solved. Now, all of these things basically, what they point at is the vital importance of a healthy sangha as a teaching context and as a teaching situation. If there isn't a healthy sangha, it's difficult for the teachings to actually happen in any meaningful way. And so, quite naturally, any teacher that has any predilection to be abusive towards their students, this will immediately pop out as completely off in comparison to what the other teachers are doing in the lineage, and what the lineage holders are doing and how they teach. So those are the kinds of safeguards, or the kind of emphasis that you can put on the way you teach, on the way that you hope that students interact with each other. But fundamentally, there's no guarantee that the Lama isn't a psychopath. And I think and I really can connect to what you were saying with you're, as a beginner, you're very vulnerable. And I always said, if I'd started in my life as a practitioner with a psychopath, I would have fallen for it, because it's very easy. But Nakshar Rinpoche and Khandro Dechin, they often say one of the key questions that people need to ask themselves is, am I a cult follower? Am I, it's not, is this a cult leader? Maybe, but am I a cult follower? Am I willing to abandon my humanity? Am I willing to take any form of abuse, have no self-respect whatsoever? Am I willing to shun others in order to be part of a kind of inner circle, which is where I'm getting some kind of some kind of status? Basically as the people that end up in cults are basically people that have low psychological health, and people that end up in cults and stay in cults and actually perpetuate the cult. Basically there's a lot of stigmas of those mental health. So I think you need to be adult in the way you look at yourself, and this is not always easy, of course, but fundamentally the only person who can tell you if you're in a cult is you. What am I doing and how am I behaving? What am I getting out of this situation? Am I feeling special about this situation? Am I cutting off from relatives? Am I being pressured to cut off from relatives? And it's a whole set of circumstances that you need to be aware of. And really, there's no other solution but making sure that people, in the Aratel we insist on this quite a lot. You need to go into a teaching situation with your eyes open, and you need to be able to ask a certain number of questions in order to know, how these things work. I mean, the work that Mary Finnegan did is eloquent in terms of how many people are willing to abandon self-respect and their own humanity in order to get something out of it. It's insane, the whole thing that developed around Sogyal Lhakpa.
I notice you don't. I share the sentiment. You don't call him Sogyal Rinpoche. Rinpoche, for anyone who's not familiar with Tibetan Buddhism, Rinpoche is a sort of one of the most respectful titles you can give a person. So, yeah, you're calling him by his family name, Lakar.
Yeah. I mean, but he was. I don't want to go into this in any great detail.
Well, I mean, for anyone listening, I'm about to do a whole episode on that. So, yeah. But it's Sogyal Lhakpa was basically from a rich merchant family. They bought the title, and he was set up as a Lama in the West, without even having studied as a Lama. He went to Western schools in India, studied whatever, or business. And he was just a fantastic con man, very charismatic, clever con man, who managed to create an empire in the West. I mean, it's extraordinary what he did, but he did it in an absolutely horrific and dysfunctional way. So no, I don't call him Rinpoche. No, yeah, with good reason. No, it's and to see how far people will go in these circumstances, I recommend people watch Wild Country on Netflix, which is about Osho, Rajneesh, and they're sort of they made a whole town in America, and one woman even tried to kill somebody, and just totally going against everything she believed in, but was just so it's that people will do totally crazy things. And I think probably the way is to educate yourself by read some books like Sex and Violence in Tibetan Buddhism by Mary Finnegan, and also watch documentaries like Wild Country. Yeah. So,
and I think there's quite good resources out there in terms of how cult behavior looks like, what it looks like, what are the markers, the kind of markers. There's a lot of literature out there which is completely non-religious, but looks at it from a sociological perspective. And I think that it's very important that people read this and are conversant with these ideas before they approach these lineages.
Yeah, it's good advice. So the last thing, and this is related to what we've just been talking about, but you've written a book on the student-teacher relationship. It's in French, so I haven't read it because being a true English person, I only speak English. I'm ashamed to say. Is there anything about that book which we haven't covered in this conversation, that might be an interesting place to kind of wrap up?
Well, I think the teacher-student relationship is probably one of the least understood things in the West vis-a-vis Tibetan Buddhism. And again, this can be a 3-hour conversation. So just to keep it kind of short and sweet, I'd say that there's a number of dysfunctional relationship modes with the teacher. And I wrote this book at the encouragement of Naksha Rinpoche and Kandra simply so that it could be out there in French in terms of it is possible to have a sane teacher-student relationship model in the West. It's not something which is reserved to medieval Tibet. It's not a kind of outdated cultural mode which doesn't make sense for the free West. So the objective here was to show that this mode of teaching is relevant to the West, and that I'm a Westerner whose teacher is a Westerner. I'm not defending any Tibetan cultural mode here. I'm not. This is not politics. This is just it's the defense of a kind of central tenet of Tibetan Buddhism, of Vajrayana. Now, the kind of misunderstandings that you have in the West about the teacher-student relationship is either it's the daddy savior therapist paradigm, where you go and you enter into relationship with the teacher thinking that this person is going to save you in ways for which you hardly need to be responsible. You just need to have this kind of emotional devotion for this person and everything is going to be all right. That's non-functional. And then you have the other side of the spectrum is, the tantric lecturer paradigm, where you think, I don't need devotion. I can just go get information from this person and the information will be enough to change me. Now the truth of it is, is both much more self-evident, but it requires a degree of maturity for it to work. I think, Naksha Rinpoche often says that true devotion, because that's what we're talking about fundamentally in the teacher-student relationship, you're trusting this person fully 100% once you've examined that person for a number of years, and this can never be overstressed. You can't go into a tantric mode of relationship with a teacher unless you've studied for them for at least 5, 6, 7 years. You need to know what this person is about, and you need to have gone beyond the kind of emotional fantasy of the early stage. It's only then that it becomes possible. And so the devotion, which is one of the topics which is discussed at great lengths in Tibetan Buddhism. Devotion is basically an energy that takes you out of yourself. Having devotion towards something is basically recognizing the extraordinary intrinsic value that that thing has, and wanting to be with it. And that's why Naksha Rinpoche has this really wonderful way of talking about devotion. He says devotion is actually understanding, recognition that the person that's in front of you actually has this depth of knowledge and experience which you don't have. And simply recognizing that means that you're starting to have some of it, because you can. There's one of the metaphors he uses for this is if you and I were to witness a world-class musician playing on the street, we'd listen, and I'm not talking about your musical skills here, I'm talking about mine, which are none. I'd listen and I'd think, oh, that's nice. if another world-class musician were to listen to a world-class musician on the street, he would hear something completely different. You know, he would actually understand the genius of the person who's playing. And it's the same thing with devotion and the capacity for the teacher-student relationship to evolve. The more your experience of practice develops, the more your devotion, your appreciation of the genius of your teacher is able to develop. And that's why, you know, when you start on the path, when you're at a very early stage in your relationship with a teacher, you can't really say that you have a lot of devotion. Saying you have a lot of devotion basically means I have a lot of realization, you know. And so it's something that develops gradually, and the more you developed your capacity to discern, to understand what's being taught, the more you recognize the genius or the skill of the person that's in front of you, and that recognition is not something which will make you be in a situation, the situations that Mary Finnegan describes, realizing the genius of your teacher and being in awe of his talent will not mean that you'll be hit on the head with a back scratcher, or being or you know, doing all these demeaning things that happen in all these dysfunctional sanghas. Being in awe of the teacher basically means that you're simply closer to your realized state, and there's nothing that needs to be done with that. It's simply your progression along the path. And so in Vajrayana, they say, you know, it's often said that the teacher is the path. You know, there is no path without a teacher, and that's really one of the central tenets of Vajrayana. And I think it's fundamental to understand how that situation can be a situation which is conducive to realization. And so that's one of the reasons I was encouraged to write that book. It was to try and make that, you know, as kind of explicit as possible for audiences in the West, and in France in particular, which are, you know, very conversant with the ethos of the teacher-student relationship, and see it more. And you see this every day. You know, you see it as you know, the rock star Lama comes, and you go and see the Lama, and you hope that you can get some blessings, and that maybe something will change for the better in your life. But you know, that's not how it works. So yeah, that's the story there.
Yeah,
I could go on, but
those are wise words. Those are wise words. And if someone wants to read your book, what's it called? You know,
it's called Le Maître Vajra, which means the Vajra master. That's it. Le Maître Vajra, and it's I think it's published by Arrow Books Worldwide. So that's where it can be found online.
And where would you direct people to find out more about gTer?
Well, there's a great number of websites up there, so you know, it can be explored in many ways. I'd basically you know, Google gTer, so you know, gTer, and you know, you'll be, you know, directed to
you might have to spell that for people.
I will indeed. So Arrow is A-R-O, and Ter is G-T-E-R, which is, you know, Ter means a terma, treasure. So, you know, the Arrow treasure. Even just Arrow Buddhism on Google, and that'll you know, take you to a number of websites. But there's a great number of websites that, you know, are there both for introduction. You have websites that go into greater detail about, you know, the non-monastic style of practice. There's a great number of books out there as well. So no, there's a great constellation of things to study. But Google is a good place to start. Yeah.
Yeah. God, that's brilliant. Well, it's really surreal to reconnect with you after 20 years, and in this kind of slightly formal arrangement, you know, where you're kind of sort of slipping into your role as a teacher of Tibetan Buddhism, you know, and yeah, it's been amazing to see, and I'm so pleased that you've done this. And I think, you know, from what I've seen of the gTer lineage, you know, I've been really impressed with it, and I think it's great.
It's good to hear.
Yeah, you're gonna have to help me with the second part of your name. So we, you know, I've got Zhal'med being the first part of your name, but I'm gonna, is it Ye-Rig? How do you say
Ye-Rig, yeah.
Ye-Rig, Ye-Rig.
It's Ye as in Yeshe and Rig as in Rigpa, Ye-Rig. But
Ye-Rig.
you know, Nakpa Zhal'med is enough. You know, Nakpa is just, you know, it's like the Mr. or the Mrs. The Nakpa Zhal'med. That's quite enough. So you don't need to worry too much about it.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, and let's keep in touch.
It has indeed.
I made all the music that I use in my podcasts. If you'd like to hear more of my music, please visit SoundCloud and check out my profile, Ralph Cree.